Hello, we are continuing with Daas Tevunos, page 592 in the bilingual edition, Siman Kufayim Beis. Amar HaZeichel, Od yesh li davar lecha inyan hazman haholich behekef al kol ha'ish meshava. Now I have to explain how time works to all beings. Umatzano bo shinuyim bechalakav mitam hazman atzmo, perush, lo mitam masim shiyu. Sheyichudshu bo, el mitam hayos ha'es hahi, masha amar koheles, lakol zman ve'es lechol chayfetz, he says that there are different times in the world, and that the times change, causing different things to happen. And the reason those things are happening, or there are those things in the world, is not because of man's actions, but rather because of the time. And then he quotes the famous verse in Koheles 3:1. And for those of you that are a little older than me, may remember the song, L'chol zman ve'es l'chol chayfetz. To every time and to every season, there is for everything under heaven. Amra HaNeshama, says Neshama, Gamze inyan nechmad l'das asa al border. This is also something very important that I would like to understand properly. Amar HaSeichel, says the intellect. Re'i, HaKochavim v'hamazalos heim mashpiyim kol echad ve'echad al davar miyuchad uprati ba'olam hashafal hazeh. The stars and the constellations, they serve to influence what happens in this world in every detail. Now here he doesn't mean the stars themselves or the constellations themselves cause different things to happen in the world, chas v'shalom, but rather the stars and the constellations represent certain spiritual forces that Hashem created that causes different events to occur in the world. And in Derech Hashem, the Ramchal discusses how the stars in the constellation are like the highest physical part of the physical world that connects with the spiritual. The stars and the constellations serve as this connection between the spiritual and the physical. But Chas v'Shalom, it's not the stars and the constellations doing anything. They just serve to represent how Hashem is influencing the physical world at a given time. Umishihu mushba mekaychav echad, somebody who's influenced by a certain star, and a mushba mechaveru, he's not influenced by another. V'chol ha-mekablim memashpi ehem tamid b'chol makom shehem. And a person who is mekabel, who gets this certain thing from the star in a certain place, he gets it in every place. Amnam milvad hapkuda hazos. Besides for this, asher hamhina yish lahem emshala ushlita b'sivuv hazmam. There are certain stars and constellations that they have influence at a certain time. Shekol echad shalit b'shah ve'es asher hu chaklo. V'zeh yadua. Each star or constellation has a certain time when it rules. So let's get an example here. There is a constellation called Mars. That means that, this is what Chaim Freelander says, that means at that time when that constellation is in its force, that there is more violence, a natiya, more of a tendency towards violence in the world. Now that doesn't mean people have to be violent, but it means that spiritually there's more of a tendency for people to become violent. Now it seems the Ramchal is talking about two things. A person who's born under a certain sign will have a tendency in his nature to be more like that sign. He's going to discuss this soon. And that affects him no matter what time of year it is, what time is. Whereas, if a person wasn't born in that sign, it will affect him less when that sign comes around for the year. So we'll take the example of someone being born under the sign of Mars. So he has a tendency to be a violent person. That doesn't mean he has to be violent. He has that tendency, and that affects him to his core. But even a person not born under that sign, when it comes to the time of year, when Mars appears, everybody will have that more violent tendency. Now he's going to discuss this more. This is known. There's a big difference between these two ideas. The person who has the influence by the sign that's special for him and he was born under it, that reaches his essence. That every aspect is dependent on it. It affects his essence. The influence of the stars that just happens throughout the time of the year, that's a more general influence. It affects the entire world. Whether it's the creatures that are specifically influenced because they were born under it, or the creations that are not specific to it. From another perspective, this Shlita, let's say it's the time of year of Mars, of that constellation, it's not a total dominance. A person just gets a certain influence. Right? It will be more easy for a person to be violent at that time. It'll definitely make an influence, because Hashem doesn't do anything for no reason. But their essential effect that they have is really on people that were born under that sign, and not just what happens through the year. Now, we keep saying people born under that sign. What that means, right, it's famous that a person, let's say he's born under Mars, he has a violent tendency. That doesn't mean he's going to be a murderer and a thief. What it means is he has that tendency for blood. So it says that he has a choice. He could either become a murderer, or he could take a job like a shochet, where he slaughters animals to feed people, or he becomes a moel, where he circumcises babies. He channels that aspect which he has, which he was born under, with a certain netiya that because Hashem puts into everybody a certain amount of character traits. So it's a question of how he deals with it. He could use it for violence, for bad things, or he could use it for mitzvahs, like we're saying, for shechita, or for bris milah, things like that. And we're saying, in addition to that, even if someone wasn't born under that trait, there are certain times of the year, there are certain times of the day, whenever it is, that a person is more influenced by different things, we'll call like in the air. But he's not as influenced as much as if he would be born under that thing. This pattern is a reflection of more concealed matters. Hashem made many emanations to influence his creatures. Like we just said. V'hi shlita kolita kol abriya. Ach ein pulaso b'shlita zos pulaso ha'ikar shu oisav mitzius ha'makabel mani b'yichud avolim kol zeh yuchudshu inyonim b'chol abriya lefi inyan hashpah ha'hi taleda shlitasim zos. Again, that there are two ideas, that a person could be born under a certain mazel, or that the mazel is going to generally affect the world at that time. Now he says there's another aspect. We have this idea of holiness of time. Right? We're just talking now about how the world is influenced, the different times of the year, or different times a person's born is influenced by different spiritual forces affecting his nature. But he said there's also other things that affect time, and that is time. There are different times which are holier than others. He says the holiness of the holidays, for example. Everything else that is dependent on time. Right? The holiness of the days means, right, when we celebrate holidays, we're not just celebrating remembrances that happened in the past, but there are certain times of the year that God made holy, meaning that it's easier, just like we said, that a person is born under a time where he might have a predilection for violence. So during the times of the year that are holy, for example, Shabbos, the holidays, that means God puts into the world spiritual energy where it's easier for us to connect to Hashem, and there's a predilection for holiness. That's how God made the universe. Each time period is different and affects us differently. So again, just like a person studies Torah, he might have more clarity in that Torah if he studies on Shabbos and Yom Tov versus if he studies during the week, which is a regular day without that infusion of holiness. And not only that, but each holiday has a different aspect of holiness that comes into the world and affects a person differently. The holiness that comes in on Pesach is different from that which comes in on Shavuos versus Purim versus Shabbos versus Hanukkah. It's all different. but it gives us the easier ability to connect to Hashem. Because again, the topic of this chapter is how Hashem controls time and influences our lives based on the times. There is in the similar aspect to this is the creation of man in all of this time. We mentioned that a person's growth is dependent on Hashem's hashpaos, his emanations. We said that a person, when he's born, he's primarily physical, and his intellect is not yet does not yet rule over him. In Lahavdil, I just heard a psychologist speak about how a person's intellect is not fully formed until he's 25. And we said that the way that works, the spiritual way that works, is that Hashem makes he emanates more, he gives more of a hashpah on a human being as he gets older, allowing him his intellect to increase and the demands of his body to decrease. Obviously, he has to use it correctly. A person can pervert his intellect and use it for non-holy things. But he has the ability to come closer to Hashem as he gets older, when his intellect, when Hashem puts emanations into the world, onto that person, that causes his intellect to increase. So he's comparing this to how Hashem affects the different time periods, and some time periods are holy, some time periods are not holy. And then he concludes here, I have spoken to you, or what I need to tell you, so you know the truth. Become and these principles to share which you asked from me, v'sula midi. And I'm not going to speak any more on this topic again, because the Ramchal here is not giving a comprehensive idea. He's just giving us the general principles. If anyone's interested also in this topic, Derech Hashem also speaks a lot about this, how the mazalos and how the constellations affect the world. And again, it's not the constellations that themselves are affecting Chas v'Shalom, but rather they serve as an intermediary. I shouldn't even say intermediary, but they're a representative. They represent how Hashem's spiritual, how he's influencing the world in a spiritual way, and it serves as the connection between the spiritual and the physical world, but they themselves are not influencing anything. And also the Ramchal Derech Hashem talks about how the different time periods of the year, how some time periods are holy, some time periods are not holy, and he also discusses, and he talks about that there, and again, the different hashpahs, and actually the fourth section of Derech Hashem, he goes into much detail about each of the holidays and what spiritual ideas are reflected in each of the holidays and how we could utilize each of the holidays to come close to Hashem.